It was a bright Monday morning, the kind that usually promised a fresh start. But for Mia, it was just another day of surviving high school. She was the quiet girl, the one who sat in the back, never raised her hand, always wore cardigans a size too big, and kept her eyes low. Most people didn't even remember her name. And the ones who did, remembered it just enough to whisper it in mocking tones. She walked into the cafeteria holding her usual lunch, a simple sandwich and an apple, carefully packed by her mom. As she passed a table near the entrance, a group of students, led by Amanda, the self-proclaimed Queen Bee of Eastwood High, caught sight of her. Amanda's loud laughter rang out as she nudged her friend, who was holding a large iced coffee. "Oh, look who's trying to blend in again," Amanda sneered. Mia paused, pretending not to hear, but her tense shoulders gave her away. That only encouraged Amanda. "Oops," Amanda said suddenly, feigning surprise as she bumped her friend's arm. In a slow motion moment, the coffee flew from the girl's hand, spinning in the air before landing squarely on Mia's pale pink dress. A shocked silence echoed in the cafeteria as the brown liquid seeped through the fabric, staining it instantly. Everyone expected her to cry, to run away. That was what shy girls did, but Mia didn't cry. She didn't run. She stood still for a heartbeat, then calmly placed her tray on the nearest table, took a deep breath, and turned around. The cafeteria watched in stunned silence. Maya's voice, usually so soft it was barely audible in class, rang out, clear and calm. "Why is it funny to hurt people you don't even know?" Amanda blinked, caught off guard. Why is it fun to destroy someone's day just to get a laugh? No one had ever heard Mia speak this much at once. The cafeteria was still. Mia stepped forward, her soaked dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin, but her voice never wavered. "I'm not invisible. I'm not a joke. I've kept my head down because I thought it was easier. But silence only gives bullies more room." Amanda opened her mouth to retort, but Mia kept going. "I came to school every day hoping no one would notice me because it was safer that way. But not anymore." Someone at a nearby table clapped. Then another. Within seconds, half the cafeteria was applauding. Mia blinked in surprise. From the far end of the room, the principal, Mr. Carter, who had been walking past during the incident, stepped forward. He had seen it all, from the cruel setup to the unexpected stand Mia had taken. He walked over to Mia and put a hand on her shoulder. "Miss Thompson," he said with a proud smile. "That took courage. Real courage. And that's something we could all learn from." Amanda's smug expression vanished as Mr. Carter turned toward her and her group. "My office. Now," he said sternly. "We don't tolerate bullying at Eastwood." The group stood up, clearly shaken, and walked out without another word. As Mia looked around, her heart thumping with adrenaline, something changed. Students she didn't even know were nodding at her, giving her small, encouraging smiles. One girl walked over and offered her a clean hoodie to cover her stained dress. "I'm Ella," she said softly. "That was amazing." Mia smiled for the first time that day. Not a forced, nervous smile, but a real one. That afternoon, Mr. Carter called a special assembly. He spoke about kindness, about bravery, and then he called Mia on stage. "This morning," he said, "students stood up against cruelty, not with anger, not with insults, but with truth, with strength, with grace. That's what leadership looks like." The applause was louder than Mia had ever imagined. She walked up to the microphone, heart pounding in her chest, but this time, she wasn't scared. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most not, and said, "Being quiet doesn't mean being weak. And standing up doesn't mean being loud. It just means deciding that enough is enough." From that day on, Maya wasn't just the shy girl in the back. She was the girl who stood up, the girl who found her voice in the middle of a storm. And the principal wasn't the only one who applauded. The whole school did. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak. That one sentence echoed in Mia's head long after the assembly had ended. It had come out of her mouth like a whisper from the deepest part of her soul, like something that had been buried for far too long and had finally clawed its way into the light. She hadn't even planned to say it. It just happened. And yet, it was truer than anything she had ever said in her life. For years, Maya had been known only as the quiet girl, the girl who didn't raise her hand, the girl who walked the halls like a shadow. People assumed things about her like they always do. They thought she was timid, scared, weak. Some even thought she was stuck up, antisocial, maybe even strange. But the truth was Mia wasn't any of those things. She wasn't broken or strange or lost. She was observant. She was thoughtful. She was patient. She felt things deeply, maybe more deeply than others. And yes, she was quiet, but never weak. The world often mistook loudness for strength. It rewarded the boldest voice, the sharpest joke, the biggest personality in the room. The quiet ones were often ignored, overlooked, pushed aside. But sometimes, it's the quietest people who carry the heaviest thoughts. It's the ones who say the least, who are listening the most, learning the most, and feeling the most. For Mia, silence had been a kind of armor. Growing up, she learned that when she spoke, people didn't always listen. Or worse, they laughed. So she stopped speaking. She let her silence speak for her. And the world, being what it is, saw that as weakness. They didn't see the girl who stayed up late reading about astronomy, who helped her neighbor's grandmother carry groceries every Sunday, who memorized poems because the words felt like home. They saw a girl who didn't fight back, who didn't defend herself, who didn't stand up. But what they didn't know was that Mia was standing every day, in her own way. She stood every time she chose kindness over cruelty. She stood every time she helped someone without asking for attention. She stood every time she sat alone at lunch and refused to let it make her bitter. Strength doesn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like endurance. Like choosing not to let the world make you hard. Like being gentle, even when the world is rough. When that coffee spilled on her dress, Maya had a choice. She could have run, like she always did. She could have cried, hidden, asked to go home. No one would have blamed her. It's what people expected of her. But something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was the embarrassment. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the quiet, powerful truth she had always known: being quiet doesn't mean being weak. So, she stood. And when she spoke, it wasn't with anger or rage. It was with honesty. And that honesty cut through the noise in the cafeteria more than any shout ever could. People listened. Not because she yelled, but because the weight of her words came from a place of truth. That's the thing about quiet strength. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it. After that day, Mia changed. But not in the way most people expected. She didn't suddenly become loud or outgoing. She didn't try to be someone she wasn't. What changed was how people saw her. They began to understand that there was more to her than silence. They began to respect her space, her words, her presence. And most importantly, Mia began to see herself differently. She no longer saw her quiet nature as a flaw. She saw it as her power. She joined the school's literary magazine, and her poetry began to circulate. People were surprised at how powerful her writing was, how full of emotion, insight, and quiet fury it was. But Mia wasn't surprised. She had been holding those words for years. She started tutoring a younger girl who was shy and soft-spoken, just like she had been. She didn't try to fix her or change her. She just helped her see that being quiet wasn't a problem. It was a gift. In time, Mia became known not just as the girl who stood up to bullies, but as someone people went to when they needed someone to really listen. She never gave long speeches or dramatic advice. She didn't have to. Sometimes she just sat next to someone and let them be. And somehow, that was enough. Strength isn't always loud. It isn't always flashy. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it takes years to show itself. But when it does, it changes everything. Mia proved that the strength to speak can live in someone who doesn't often talk. The courage to stand can exist in someone who's never been noticed. And the power to lead can come from the most unexpected places. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak. It never did. And once the world sees that, it can never unsee it. Silence only gives bullies more room. That truth had lived like a whisper in Mia's heart for years. Not because she didn't know it, but because admitting it out loud meant owning the pain that came with it. Mia had watched countless moments in her life unfold where she remained silent. Times when she saw someone pushed in the hallway and didn't say a word. Times when cruel notes were passed in class and she pretended not to see them. Times when Amanda and her group made mocking jokes about other kids and Mia just kept her head down, hoping the laughter wouldn't turn in her direction. Silence had become her shield. She used it to survive, to avoid becoming the next target. But in doing so, she had unknowingly given bullies space. Space to grow. Space to repeat their behavior. Space to believe that no one would stop them. Bullies don't just thrive on power. They thrive on the absence of resistance. It doesn't always have to be a fight. Most bullies don't expect one. But when no one challenges them, when people look away, when the hurt is met with a shrug or silence, they grow bolder. They learn that their words have no consequence, that cruelty is entertainment, that they can paint people with shame, and no one will even try to wash it off. Maya had watched this pattern play out too many times. It was like a performance, and the audience, herself included, was always too afraid to interrupt. Until the day she was the one standing in the spotlight, coffee dripping down her dress, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. It would have been so easy to run, to escape to the bathroom, to hide in a stall, to cry quietly until the bell rang and the halls cleared out. That had been her plan many times before. But something was different that day. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the realization that her silence was no longer protecting her. It was empowering them. The more she stayed quiet, the more space she gave Amanda to laugh. The more she stayed quiet, the more other students assumed it was okay to ignore what had happened. The more she stayed quiet, the smaller she became in her own story. And so, Maya made a choice that wasn't born out of confidence, but necessity. She spoke, not loudly, but clearly. Her voice didn't boom, but it carried, because truth has a way of doing that. It fills spaces where lies and cruelty have taken root. Her words were simple, but they cut through the tension in the cafeteria like glass. Why is it funny to hurt people you don't even know? That question wasn't just for Amanda. It was for everyone watching. It was for the students who had laughed, for the teachers who had turned a blind eye in the past, for the ones who whispered gossip but never defended anyone. It was even for herself. In that moment, silence lost its power, not because noise replaced it, but because courage did. Mia wasn't screaming. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't attacking. She was simply refusing to be invisible. That refusal created a ripple, the kind that starts small but spreads fast. A single pair of clapping hands turned into a wave of applause, not because they were cheering for drama, but because they recognized what had just happened. A line had been drawn. Someone had broken the pattern. What happened afterward wasn't magic. Amanda didn't suddenly become kind. The bullies weren't transformed overnight, but they were exposed. And once cruelty is seen for what it is, it becomes harder to accept. The principal's response, the assembly, the recognition, those things mattered. But what mattered more was the shift in awareness. People began noticing things they used to overlook. Jokes didn't land the same way. Whispers lost their venom. Eyes started watching not just the victims, but the perpetrators. Maya realized something even more important in the days that followed. Silence doesn't just give bullies room. It takes space away from the people who need it most. The kids who were too afraid to walk down certain hallways. The ones who pretended not to care that they were always chosen last. The ones who never brought lunch because they didn't want to sit alone. Her silence had once been a survival strategy, but now her voice was becoming a shield, not just for herself, but for others. She started noticing how her small actions mattered. When she saw a boy drop his books in the hallway and no one helped him, she bent down first. When a girl got mocked for wearing the same sweater 2 days in a row, Mia complimented her on its color. They were small moments, barely noticeable on their own, but they were moments where silence didn't win. She joined a peer support group, not to speak all the time, but to listen. And when she did speak, people listened, because Mia spoke with purpose. She had learned that you don't have to be loud to take up space. You just have to be present. You have to care. You have to refuse to let cruelty pass unchecked. Silence may feel safe, but it can also be a prison. It can keep people small. It can protect the very behaviors that hurt us. Maya didn't want to live in that prison anymore, and she didn't want others to live there either. So she broke it. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. And now, every time she walks into a room, she walks in knowing that her presence matters. Her voice, when used, echoes. Her silence, when chosen, is not out of fear but strength. Silence only gives bullies more room, but courage takes that space back. That took courage, real courage. The principal's words echoed in Mia's mind long after the applause had faded and the assembly hall had emptied. She had never thought of herself as courageous. Brave were the kids who stood in front of crowds during talent shows, who volunteered to speak in class without rehearsing their answers 100 times in their heads. Brave were the athletes who took risks on the field, the leaders of clubs who seemed to radiate confidence. Not she had spent most of her life trying not to be seen. She thought courage belonged to the loud, the bold, the naturally fearless. But that day, standing in the cafeteria with coffee dripping from her dress and the stares of dozens of students burning into her skin, she learned something she had never truly believed before. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it stands quietly. Sometimes it shows up in the most unexpected people at the most unexpected moments. When Mr. Carter looked her in the eyes and said those words, He didn't say them the way teachers often say things, out of obligation or to soften a moment. He meant it. There was no pity in his voice, no exaggeration, just truth. And it made something crack open inside her. Courage, she realized, wasn't about not being afraid. It was about acting despite fear, about stepping forward when everything in your body screams to step back. Mia hadn't planned to speak that day. She didn't wake up thinking she would confront a bully or say something that would ripple across the whole school. She was just trying to survive, like always. But sometimes life corners you. It puts you in situations where silence feels like surrender, and the only way to reclaim a piece of yourself is to speak. That moment, the choice to speak, wasn't grand or cinematic. It was simple. It came from a place of exhaustion, of quiet strength, of truth that could no longer stay buried. And the courage didn't end in the cafeteria. It followed her in the days that came next, when whispers chased her down the hallway. Not all cruel, but not all kind either. When people stared a little longer, not sure if they were looking at the same girl they thought they knew. It took courage to walk with her head high, even when her legs wanted to turn around and run. It took courage to sit through class knowing that people were talking about her. It took courage to go back to the same cafeteria, walk past the same table, and choose not to shrink. But something amazing happened. Other students started to find their own courage too. It wasn't always big. Sometimes it was a boy standing up to a joke that went too far. Sometimes it was a girl offering her seat to someone sitting alone. One time, a student in Mia's chemistry class raised their hand to defend another during a group discussion. Small things, but powerful. Courage, it seemed, was contagious. Maya was invited to speak at a school board meeting about student safety and bullying prevention. The thought terrified her. Her voice shook as she stepped up to the podium, her palms clammy, her notes wrinkled from being folded and unfolded a dozen times. But as she began to speak, sharing her story, not for sympathy but for change, something shifted again. She looked out at the audience, at parents, teachers, and administrators, and saw not just adults, but people listening, really listening. She spoke about how courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you practice. She said that students shouldn't have to be loud to be heard. That schools should be places where speaking out doesn't feel dangerous. She spoke not just for herself, but for every quiet student who had ever been laughed at, ignored, or pushed aside. And when she finished, the applause wasn't just polite, it was sincere. One board member stood up and said, "Thank you for reminding us what courage looks like." But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 2 weeks later, when Mia was approached by a younger student in the library. She was maybe 13, tiny, with glasses that were too big for her face and a voice so soft it barely rose above a whisper. She told Mia, "I saw you that day in the cafeteria. You made me feel like maybe I could speak up too." Maya didn't need applause after that. That one sentence was enough to reaffirm everything. What Mr. Carter said, that took courage. Real courage. Wasn't just a compliment. It was an awakening. It taught Maya that courage isn't measured by how loud you speak, but by how honest you're willing to be when the world tries to silence you. It taught her that courage doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears fear and uncertainty, and still shows up anyway. She kept growing into her voice, not abandoning her quiet nature, but learning how to let her quiet coexist with strength. She didn't become someone else, she became more of who she truly was. And in doing so, she showed others that they could do the same. That courage might not come naturally, but it always starts with one decision, the decision to act, to speak, to stand. Real courage doesn't need a stage or spotlight. It doesn't always come with praise or recognition. Sometimes, it looks like a shy girl in a coffee-stained dress, standing in a crowded room, daring to tell the truth when no one else will. And that kind of courage, quiet, honest, unshakable, is the kind that changes everything. She was the girl who stood up. That label followed Mia for the rest of the school year, and in time, it became something more than just a memory. It became a symbol, not just of what she had done, but of what was possible. When the coffee had spilled across her dress that morning, Mia had no intention of becoming anyone's symbol. She didn't stand up for attention. She didn't speak to be remembered. She did it because it was the only thing left to do. And somehow, that one moment, short, trembling, quiet, turned into a defining piece of who she was. She was the girl who stood up. At first, people used it like a title. Teachers mentioned her in assemblies. Students whispered about her when she passed. Even students from other grades who hadn't known her name before began referring to her with a kind of admiration usually reserved for the outgoing or popular. Mia found it strange at first. She hadn't changed overnight. She was still quiet, still cautious, still preferred books to crowds and reflection to noise. But something inside her had shifted. She had found her voice, not just in that one cafeteria confrontation, but in the days that followed, every time she chose not to fade into the background again. Standing up wasn't a one-time act. It became a way of moving through the world. And that's what Mia started to understand. To stand up didn't always mean facing a bully in front of everyone. Sometimes it meant helping someone without needing credit. Sometimes it meant raising her hand in class when she used to stay silent. Sometimes it meant telling herself, "You matter." On the mornings she still wanted to disappear. Being the girl who stood up meant carrying the weight of expectations too. Some people assumed she would be fearless from then on, that she would always know what to say, that she had answers. But courage wasn't something you owned once and forever. It was something you had to choose again and again, often in moments when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Mia still had her fears, still had days where her chest tightened at the thought of speaking. But now she knew something powerful, that fear didn't get the final say. Other students began coming to her, not for advice, always, but just to talk, just to sit. One girl sat beside her in art class and asked, "How did you do it? Weren't you scared?" Mia had smiled gently and said, "I was terrified, but I did it anyway." That honesty, simple and unpretentious, meant more than any speech. Mia didn't pretend to be fearless. She didn't preach. She listened. That's what made her different. She understood what it meant to feel invisible. And now she worked, quietly, steadily, to help others feel seen. The school started changing in subtle ways too. The principal launched a peer-led anti-bullying program inspired by Mia's story. He asked her to help shape it, not because she was loud, but because she understood the quiet battles so many students fought every day. Mia suggested including a journal writing component. "Some kids won't talk out loud," she explained, "but they still have things to say." The suggestion was implemented, and within weeks, the program had more engagement than anyone expected. There was another boy, David, who had been in Mia's class for 2 years, but had never spoken to her before. He was quiet too, though not in the same way. His silence had an edge, the kind that came from too many days of being mocked and too few of being believed in. After Mia's story spread, he started walking past her desk and giving her the smallest nod, as if to say, "Thank you." One day, he left a note on her desk. It simply said, "You made me feel like maybe I matter." That was when it hit Mia. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had stood up for others, too. People she didn't know were watching, people who needed to see that it could be done. She became the proof that change was possible, not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more of who she already was. She was the girl who stood up, not once, but again and again. She stood up when she chose to lead the writing workshop for nervous freshmen. She stood up when she quietly corrected a rumor without fanfare. She stood up when she helped a classmate who was being laughed at for stuttering, sitting beside him and whispering, "Take your time." She stood up in ways that weren't always public, weren't always applauded, but they were real. And over time, she began to realize something even deeper. Standing up isn't just about resistance. It's about creation, about creating a safer space, a braver space, a kinder space, not just for yourself, but for others. It's about showing others that it's okay to be seen, that it's okay to speak, that it's okay to exist exactly as you are. Years later, when she looked back on high school, Mia wouldn't remember every detail of that day in the cafeteria. She wouldn't remember every whisper or every headline, but she would always remember how it felt to finally stand up, how her voice shook but didn't break, how the room fell silent, not because she demanded it, but because the truth has a gravity of its own. And she would remember the students who came after her, walking a little taller, speaking a little freer, because they had seen what was possible. She was the girl who stood up, not because she had all the answers, not because she was unafraid, but because, in a moment when it would have been easier to disappear, she chose to rise. And that choice, quiet, honest, and brave, changed everything. The whole school applauded, not just for the words Mia spoke in the cafeteria or the courage she showed standing up to Amanda, but for something deeper. For the honesty she carried when no one expected it. For the strength she showed when silence had always seemed like the safest option. For showing everyone that courage didn't always look like shouting or fighting back. It could look like a girl in a coffee, stained dress, standing her ground with trembling hands and clear eyes. The moment she finished speaking that day, there was a stillness in the room. The kind that comes when truth has been spoken, the kind of pause that exists before change begins. And then, slowly, the room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't just clapping because they felt sorry for her. It was something else entirely. It was respect. It was awe. It was people realizing that they had just witnessed something rare and real. Maya had become a mirror for the school. In standing up, she showed others a reflection of their own fears, their own silences, their own moments when they had wanted to speak but didn't. And in doing so, she gave them permission to be braver. The applause was a release, not just of support for Maya, but of all the things so many students had been holding back: fear, frustration, regret, hope. In one moment, they were all released into the air like breath after holding it for too long. For days after the incident, students kept approaching her. Some thanked her. Some shared stories of their own. Times they had been bullied. Times they had watched it happen and done nothing. Times they had needed someone to tell them it was okay to stand up. Even teachers looked at her differently. They saw not just a student, but a young woman with insight and fire. But more important than how others saw her was how Mia began to see herself. She no longer shrank when people looked her way. She no longer felt like she had to hide behind her silence. She wasn't trying to be someone else. She was becoming more of herself. Freer, fuller, unafraid to take up space. She started speaking up in class, not always loudly, but clearly. When someone interrupted her, she didn't fall silent like before. She waited and finished what she was saying. Her confidence wasn't a performance. It was rooted in the knowledge that her voice mattered. She joined the school's kindness committee and proposed a new campaign: Applaud the Quiet. The idea was simple: recognize those whose strength wasn't always visible. The ones who helped others behind the scenes, who listened when no one else would, who stayed kind, even when no one noticed. The campaign included handwritten notes placed anonymously in lockers, kindness shout-outs in the morning announcements, and even a wall of quiet heroes in the hallway. And the response: overwhelming.